Hi there, this video will demonstrate how to create backgrounds for a 2D game in Unity, and we'll also talk about how to create parallax movement so that it feels like there's more of a 3D space as the background is moving according to what the player is doing. So I'm going to come back and I'll create this and show you how I got to this point, but I basically have a Photoshop file. It's a 1920 by 1080 document. We'll come back and talk about why. And then I have different layers for different areas of my background that I need to move independently. So if you want just a background that stays stationary in your scene as the player moves, then we would just flatten this image down to one layer, save that out. But what the goal was here is that I have these different layers, and as the player moves, we have motion in the background that makes it look like objects that are closer to the player are moving faster than objects that are further away that are not moving as much. And that motion is called parallax motion. In our real world, this happens naturally. If we look off in the distance as we're driving in a car and moving around, the objects further away will move slower, the objects closer to us will move faster. And we can replicate that in video games, especially in a 2D standpoint, to give the appearance that there is natural movement according to the camera, the player in front of other environment objects. So what we'll do, I have each one on a different layer, is eventually come back and export these as different layers. We're going to go into Unity for a second, and this is where I left off with my previous video of adding environment assets through tile sets and individual sprites. So in this video, we're going to talk about how to create background elements as individual sprite layers, and then how we're adding the parallax movement to it. So one thing we want to make sure is we go to the game mode, and if I look at the free aspect drop down, I want to determine what aspect ratio I want my composition to be. If I wanted to do any of the other ones I can, but what I'm going to do is just choose 16 by 9, so that way that makes sure that my composition, my game will run at 16 by 9, and as default that's going to be 1920 by 1080. There are other aspect ratios you can look at as well, but that's the one we're going to choose. So now that I know my game will play in a 16 by 9 or 1920 by 1080 resolution, that's what I'm going to create for my backgrounds. And then we're going to create the visuals in a way that they'll tile horizontally. So as the player moves left or right, it'll repeat this background image. And that's what I have done here. So let's create a new one and go to File, New. And this is going to be a 1920 by 1080 pixel image. Alright. We're going to have a background layer here. And we'll just tile it BG. And this is going to be like my sky. So let's get like a brush tool. Scale it up. I'm going to make sure I have a hardness right now. This is meant for like a stylized pixel-based artwork. So let's come in here with the blue, and I'll just show you some examples for the sky. Okay. I'm going to come into my brush and change my spacing so it's closer together. 1% spacing there. There we go, so it's a smoother finish. And then I'm slowly just going to darken that a little more. And then we'll add another line, then we'll darken it a little more. Blend that in. And I'm just looking for kind of a gradient, but not a smooth gradient. So this is just like the sky background. You can blend it more for particular purposes. Do a little bit darker. Maybe it eventually does get down here. Pretty dark value. Yeah. Alright, so there's my sky background. The one thing we want to go ahead and think about is how this image is going to tile. And to correct tiling issues, we're going to select that layer, and we're going to filter, other, and offset. Now, it shows me, because I've already typed in this value, but if my image is 1920 pixels, then I want to half that. So half that value is 960. So that will bring the left border over here and the right border over there. So that shows me how this is going to tile horizontally. So if I do half of the horizontal width for the offset horizontal, click OK. That shows me my center border edge now, which is what would be the outer corners. So let's get our brush tool. I'm going to hold down Alt to sample some colors. And then I can just simply come in here and kind of blend that line together. Let's grab this one, blend that line, grab this one, blend that line, grab this one, blend that line. Now this image will fully tile. So that corrects the sides. If I go back to image or filter other offset and add 960 back to this, that'll blend that layer. So I can come back and kind of fix any of these other small little areas. But now I know this image will tile perfectly. On top of that, I'm going to add other layers with a transparent background for my mountains or whatever my near, mid, and far layers will have here. So maybe we'll do like a kind of an orangish gray since we did some blues. And these will be kind of mountains. So objects closer to us will have more saturated, more contrast to them than mountains or whatnot that are going to be further away. So let's just come in here and just do some kind of mountains. There you go. And we'll blend this in. Alright, so there's going to be kind of one layer of mountains. I want to come back and make sure this tiles properly. So we're going to go to Filter, Other, Offset. We'll add our 960 again. And then just come in here and kind of paint this back. So maybe this one's going to be much larger. There you go. So I know that image is going to tile properly. So we'll also go back, Filter, Other, Offset to reset it back to its default. There you go. So that will be our near layer. And I'm just naming these so I can remember. We'll just do 3. Mid. This one's going to be slightly more gray. So I can tell the difference between the background. And I'm going to do offset kind of lines. We can actually pull this behind it so I can see it as I'm drawing it. Okay. There we go. Turn this layer off for a second and then just kind of draw these areas back in here. So what I'm really trying to do here is just build some background elements that will have some depth to it. So let's create a new layer and we're going to add even more gray to this. And this is going to be like my far. So we'll do far layer. Far. Here we go. So we need some big mountains back here. Okay. There you go. Some mountains up there. Maybe a little smaller one. Right there. Okay. We'll fill it in. And I'm just making sure I'm filling all the way down to the bottom just so that it's easy to see. And I know everything's filled in as they're moving, so that way it will blend everything properly. So I'm just filling it all the way down. And then I'll pull that one down to the back. Alright, so my near layer I know is blended properly to a horizontally tile. My mid layer I need to make sure I do that. So we'll do Filter, Other, Offset, add 960. And then we'll just come in here and kind of blend that little mountain down. And then my far layer, actually let's go back to our mid and reset that. So we're going to do Filter, Other, Offset again. There we go. Now with my far layer, let's do the same thing here. Alright, Other, Offset, and we just need to, let's kind of erase this out. There we go. Make sure that blends that way. And we'll reset that one back. There you go. So what I want is several different layers that will loop, repeat, and they're going to move in front of each other. So we just need to make sure that everything tiles horizontally. So as we repeat this in Unity, it will work properly. Now the only difference I've done here is I've come to my different layers. Let's see, so that one's far. mid, and near. Is I've added some highlights. So I just took a brush, I selected one of these, and I added some highlights. I can come back over here and do this. So here's my near layer. I'm going to hold down Control and click on the preview. And let's get our brush tool and sample that. And let's make a lighter value for some highlights. And I'm just going to come over here and kind of drag over the tops of each mountain. Kind of some highlights, and then I'm going to come on the opposite side, much darker value. And on the opposite side of the mountain, I'm going to come over here and drag some shadows. Okay, and then kind of wisp this down here. Now, once again, I'm doing a kind of stylized kind of approach here. So I'm not looking for a complex look. I want to add some depth to it. I want to add a little bit of highlights and shadows so that it comes in here and we have some depth now. Now, once you do that, I need to make sure, let's hit Control D to deselect. I do need to make sure that it does repeat. So let's go back to filter other offset. So it doesn't in the middle here. So I just need to come back, kind of correct that. Maybe some of these heels blend together. So that way that crease for where it is blending is not visible. So we'll go back and reset that filter other offset. So that's the only difference I've really done here. Some different colors, but other than that, I have some simple highlights and shadows. Highlights on one side, shadows on the opposite side. And I have that for all of my different layers here. Just kind of played around with some of the shadow designs of it. But the key thing with our individual mountain layers is that it has a transparent background. So the bottom is filled in, but the top is transparent. And each one of these will loop properly. All right. So now that we've got our background layers created, we're going to save these out individually as individual sprite images into our folder. So I'm going to turn off my other layers and just have my background layer visible. And I'm going to choose File, Save As, and in my folder I have a sprites folder that I've created before that. If you don't have a sprites folder, you can create a new sprites folder. And I'm going to say background plane. We'll call this one Sky. Okay, let's change this to a PNG image. I have some other PNG images from the previous video. Background plane Sky. Save that one. And then now I'm going to turn that layer off and turn on my far layer. Yep. And we'll do the same thing. Save as. I'm going to find our folder. Change it to PNG. And this one's going to be background plane far. Right, so we're going to go through and save each one of our mountain or background layers the same exact way. Make sure we're in that assets folder. Okay, and then this one is our mid layer. And this is our near layer. You can have as many layers as you want to, but this is just a starting point. Sprites, and then we'll call this one background planes near. Here we go. All right. So in and still save out your Photoshop file so we don't lose all of our work. But in our Unity project, now we have our individual layers. There's our sky. These are the sprite images. There is, I can't see, near, mid, and far. Okay, so we want them as different layers. That's going to be important. All right, so I have other objects in my hierarchy. What I want to do is add my background to my camera. Now, there's a lot of ways we can add backgrounds. We can just add it as an object. But for this particular purpose, I want to create parallax motion. So when the player is moving objects closer in the background to the player will move more than objects further away. So as in they'll move more with the player, and objects further away, the mountains further away in the sky, will move less when the player moves. So I'm going to add these background image planes and parent them underneath the camera. So let's drag our background image plane, the sky, and drop it behind the camera. Okay, and let's do the same thing for all of our other ones. So here is our, let's try the far one, far, and then mid. Whoop, missed that one. Mid, and then near. Here we go. Alright, so with these layers, I need to change these to a different sorting layer. So I'm going to select those 4 layers, and we're going to change the sorting layer to background. Okay. And I actually have a background object already in here. So let me just turn off the active button for that so I can see everything else. Here we go. So I want these planes to move with the camera according to a script that I'm going to add. I've added a sorting layer, and then the other thing with sorting layer is the order of the sorting layer, so that way we can see everything. All 4 of these planes are on the background sorting layer, but to also just make sure that they're visually showing up how I want them to, let's get out of game mode and go to scene mode. There we go. I want to change the order in layer. So with the sky background, that's a very farthest away background. I want to change that to, I can leave that at 0, but I'm just going to use 1. Okay, and then the far background plane, which is my farthest mountains, let's change that to 2, and that should become visible next. And then the mid, let's change that to 3. That'll put that in front of the far mountains. And then the near, let's change that to 4. So basically they're all on the same sorting layer background, but then we can tell it with the order and layer which of these planes is in front of the other ones. So that's a really good way to kind of organize planes or objects on the same sorting layer, but still put some in front of the others. And that's also going to be helpful when we start to move these around as well. Alright, so that's the integration. When I hit play and move around, the background will move with it because the camera is tied to the player action. Okay. Well, the issue is that, well, if I fall off, it doesn't repeat and I can see the corners of it. So we're going to come back and make a couple other adjustments to this later, but let's go ahead and create our script. We need a script in order to determine how this is going to move those different layers or those different planes. So in our scripts folder, we're going to right click and choose create new C# script. And we're going to call this one background parallax. Alright, so there's our background parallax. I'm going to open up that script. I'm using Visual Studio Code for this. And we need a couple of variables, and we're going to use void start and void update. Because it's movement oriented, so just as with same with what we had for character movement, we're going to use void start and void update. So before void start, we're going to add a couple of variables so we can use these. The first is going to be a private variable, so private float, and the attribute name is going to be length, or type is going to be length, and then we're just going to call this one start position and end it with a semicolon. So this is going to be used to determine the starting position of the background layer. Underneath that, we're going to add a public variable, public game object, and we need a reference for the camera. So we're just going to call this one camera 1. And then we're going to drag in our camera to this attribute so that way this script can know what the camera is doing. All right. The last one we need is a float, public float, and we're going to call this one parallax effect. And this is going to be a value we're going to drive in Unity to determine how much that particular background layer can move when the player moves. Alright, so in void start we need to determine the initial position of the planes, the background layers, and then we also need to determine the initial length, which is how wide the the background plane is. So we're going to title this first one start position. We're going to reference our start position that we created to begin with. And then we'll come back and reference our length to begin with. So sorry, I misspoke earlier. Length is going to be one variable that we're going to create, and then start position is another variable. So we need to determine what the start position is, and this is going to be a transform.position.x. And this is the start position of the background plane. Where is it located on the x-axis? The second thing we need to determine is the length of that. So we're going to do length equals get component, and what we're looking for is the size of the sprite itself. So we're going to open up an angle bracket and we'll say sprite renderer end angle bracket. We're going to open close a parentheses, then we're going to do dot bounds dot size dot x, and we're going to do semicolon. So what that is going to do is with this image, it's going to look at the sprite renderer and look at the bounds of the side of the horizontal, the x-axis side of the object. So we're getting a reference from that. All right, there we go. So before we do anything with movement, we need to understand the start position and horizontal length, the x-axis for that. All right, in void update, we need to determine a couple other variables and then add that to how much the planes, these background elements, are moving. So we need one variable called float, and we're just going to title this one temp right now. It's just a temporary variable that we're going to have. And then we're also going to need another one called distance. So we'll do float dist. Okay. All right, so we'll come back and add to those two later. Okay, so we need to know first the camera's transform. So we're going to do cam1 dot transform dot position x. We need to know the position of the camera, position x, and then we're going to do times, and we're going to open up a parentheses and do 1 minus whatever we determine as the parallax effect value. And we'll close those two and put a semicolon. So this is going to allow it to kind of move the plane according to the camera's position. 1 minus that. So it's going to allow it to kind of move it with that motion. For the float distance, we also need to find the camera 1 dot transform dot position x. We're going to do times the parallax effect by itself. Close parentheses, semicolon. All right, so we'll come back and now we're going to use that in our default transform position, and then in an if statement that we're going to determine if it's moving left or right, and then how much to use that parallax motion. All right, so underneath our two floats that we just created, we're going to do transform.position, which is going to be the movement of the background plane, equals, we're going to need to do a new vector 3 for motion. We're going to go back and reference our start position. So our start position is the transform.position.x. So our new vector 3, we're going to do start position, spell correctly, start position plus the distance. The distance is the camera position times the parallax effect that we're going to adjust. So plus dist, what we call that variable. And then we need to type in the other two values because we're only worried about the x. So we need to type in transform.position.y, comma, transform.position.z. Close parentheses, semicolon. So that's the initial transform position of the plane. All right. We're going to return down a couple times, and here's our if statement that we're going to add to determine how much to move the plane compared to what the camera is doing. All right, so we're going to do if, and we'll open up parentheses, our temp value, which is this line right here. Okay, it's going to be the times 1 minus parallax effect. So if our temp is greater than the start position plus length, so we did our length is the plus the size horizontally of our background plane, then we want to do something. So we're going to turn down, open and close our curly brackets. We're going to do start position plus or equals to the length, semicolon. All right, now let's get down underneath our if statement, and we need an else if. So if it's greater than or equal to, or greater than the start position plus length, then add motion according to the length. If not, we need an else if. And we'll do temp is less than start position minus length. Okay. We'll open and close our curly brackets. Then we're going to do start position minus or equals to length. All right. So it's not going to do anything until we actually add in our parallax effect value to our individual layers, but this is the basic setup to get parallax motion running. Let's hit Control S to save. And let's go back into Unity, let it compile. Oh, I got a on line 33, I'm missing a curly bracket. So let's go back in here. 33. There's that one. Yep. Okay, so we need one more to finish up our void. I guess I removed that at some point. Save, go back in Unity. All right, there we go. So our script is good. Okay, so now we need to, let's make a couple of copies of our background so that we can see this kind of in motion without it having to kind of repeat it. Well, it is going to repeat it automatically for us, but this will help us to be able to see this. So I'm going to double click or click on all 4 of my layers, and we're going to right click and choose duplicate. And then these 4, whoops, are going to move over and snap there. There you go. And then let's take these 4 again, and we'll choose duplicate, and we'll move those to the other side. So I'm just making a couple of copies right now. Here we go, until that snaps. Looks pretty good. Okay, so before I add my script to each one of these, I want to make sure all of my sky layers, copies, are underneath my base sky. So I have one base sky. Let's see, there's sky 2, so let's drag that underneath there. And let's say far copy is going underneath the far. So I'm just moving my copies underneath one version of that. And near, there we go. So all of my copies, my 2 copies, are underneath my one near, one mid, one far, one sky. The one thing I can also do is come in here and create an empty game object just for a hierarchy standpoint. And we can say background planes. Let's parent that underneath the camera, and then we will take all of our main copies of our 4 different layers and drag them underneath background planes. Actually, before I do that, let's undo that. Let's go to our background planes empty game object and make sure we take our transform and do reset. Puts it back to the middle, and then now we can parent our background planes underneath our empty game object called background planes. Just an organizational method. Okay, so we've made copies, but we're only going to add our script to the hierarchy node, and then the other copies will take in the same script. So we're going to take our background background parallax script, and drag that into each one of these layers. Okay, so we're going to do that here. It's one of our main layers. Here we go. And the other thing we need to do is drag our camera into the cam1 object of that script. So let's take our camera, drag that in, and we'll repeat for each one of these. Each one of our main layers here, drag in that main camera. Whoop, I missed one. There we go. All right. So if I hit play, nothing's going to happen differently than what I already have. The background's not going to move with the character. So what will allow this to happen or to work is the parallax effect. So my sky is going to be set to 1, parallax effect 1, which means the background will not move. And then as I get closer and closer to the character, I'm going to add a less and less value, which will add more movement to the parallax object. So background plane far, let's try just 0.75. Background plane mid, let's change that to 0.5. Background plane near, let's change that to 0.25. So as I get closer, the near mountain will move more than the other layers behind it. All right, let's play. All right, so now if I move, now that parallax motion is taking over. So you can see the background is moving more. For the objects closer to me, the background is moving less for the objects further away, which gives a sense of depth in my scene. Whereas before, we didn't have depth. So let's come back and let me just copy this, like duplicate this plane or my ground collision. So duplicate, move this way over here, and duplicate, move this one way over here, and let's just make a couple of copies. I have some other elements that are in the way, so I can turn that ground set off. There you go. To show you that it'll move, let's get out of the way there. Okay, so it'll continue to tile it. Okay. So if I keep moving over here, it'll continue to tile it over and over again. You can see it like picked up the tiling there. I can actually take my camera and let's zoom in some. So let's do 5 for the camera so we're closer. And I change my size for the camera there. So that way I'm much closer to my scene. Jump over my speed up there. And now we can see that parallax motion happening. So we can't see outside of our plane, our background plane, so we can see everything kind of running in there. So that's an easy way to do parallax motion. You can go back and you can come in here and change the parallax effect. Value of 1 means it's not going to move. Closer to 0 means it's going to move faster. So you can determine how fast you want the foreground elements to move versus the background elements. But that's how we can set up parallax motion in more complex backgrounds within Unity. That'll wrap up this video.